Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, a town built on echoes. The thunder of John Brown's last stand still haunted the hills. The boom of Union cannons seemed to reverberate through the valleys long after the war had ended. And at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac, the water itself whispered like a restless ghost, reminding the town of all it had seen, all it had endured. But in the year 1896, another echo began, one that no musket fire, no sermon, no prayer could silence. It was quieter, more insidious, and it came not from soldiers or battlefields, but from within the very heart of the town, from a home that wore the mask of welcome. It began with a house, ordinary on the outside, unremarkable to passing eyes. Whitewashed boards, a roof sagging slightly with age, a fence that leaned toward the lane like a weary old man. If you passed by too quickly, you wouldn't even notice it. Just another dwelling in a town of tired buildings, another shadow against the mountainside. 2 sisters lived there. Their names drifted between conversations in town, spoken with a kind of cautious respect. They were not outsiders. They had grown up in Harpers Ferry, raised in that very house after the war tore their family apart. They knew everyone by face, if not by name, and though they lived alone, they were never seen wanting. The sisters opened their doors to travelers. A meal, a bed, a roof overhead. It was the kind of hospitality that seemed almost old-fashioned in a town bustling with railroad men, peddlers, and fortune seekers. For some, it was a kindness, a small mercy on the endless road. For others, it was the last kindness they would ever know. At first, there was nothing remarkable about their generosity. Rail lines had turned Harpers Ferry into a crossroads, and boarding houses sprang up to catch the traffic. The sisters' home was smaller than most, but it offered a sense of warmth the larger inns often lacked. A table set with simple food, a lantern glowing in the window late at night, promising safety. But shadows clung to that house in ways no lamplight could chase away. Whispers crept through the town, as whispers often do. They began in corners of the saloon, in hushed tones during Sunday service, in the murmurs of women at the pump. A traveler had come through and spoken of a stew that left a strange aftertaste. Another had lodged there and was never seen again, his belongings left behind as though he had stepped out and vanished into thin air. Neighbors began to notice the windows. How often they glowed late into the night, well after the town had gone dark. How sometimes a shadow crossed the curtains when no guest was supposed to be inside. At first, it was gossip. Harpers Ferry had seen its share of rumors, and most died quickly in the light of day. But this lingered. Each new whisper seemed to weave itself into the last, until the shape of something darker began to form. And then, in the autumn of 1896, the whispers erupted into fear. One man, his name lost to time, but his terror remembered, came stumbling into the street from the sisters' home. His face was pale as candle wax, his eyes wide and unseeing, his voice broken into fragments that no one could piece together. He ran like a man pursued by something no living creature should ever have to face. Witnesses swore he screamed, though what words he used no one could agree upon. Some claimed he shouted about a cellar, others about a body, but all agreed on one thing: he left that house as if he had brushed against death itself. He vanished by morning, gone from Harpers Ferry without so much as a trace. And whatever he saw, whatever he could not bring himself to say, remained locked in silence. The sheriff wrote nothing. Perhaps he was bribed, perhaps he was afraid, or perhaps he, like so many others, chose not to believe what was easier left in the shadows. The papers buried the matter as though it had never happened, but the town could not forget. Mothers pulled their children closer when passing the house. Men lowered their voices when speaking of the sisters, and each time a traveler failed to arrive at his next destination, the rumors grew teeth, because the truth was simple and terrifying. What the sisters served was not only supper, it was something much darker. History would try to erase it. Records would vanish. Names would be struck from ledgers, and for decades the house stood as little more than a cautionary tale, a whisper told to frighten children. But beneath the silence, the truth endured. A truth carved into memory, too grotesque to be buried completely. And tonight, that truth is uncovered once more. We opened the case so that the papers would not print. The case the sheriff would not record. The case Harpers Ferry has tried again and again to forget. A case of two sisters, a house of supper and silence, and the echoes of 1896 that still haunt the town to this day, because what they fed their guests was not just food, it was fear. And what they took was not just money or belongings, it was something far more sacred and far more horrifying. Welcome back to Truth Uncaged. If this is your first time here, understand something right away. This is not a place for fairy tales, not for bedtime stories. What we say here does not soothe or comfort us. It does not hold your hand or promise that the world is as safe as we'd all like to believe. We deal with what was buried, what was forgotten, or perhaps most chilling of all, what was deliberately silenced, because silence is never innocent. When you peel it back, silence always hides something. Sometimes it hides shame, sometimes guilt, and sometimes, as we'll see tonight, it hides the kind of horror that entire towns would rather erase from memory than confront in daylight. And tonight, that silence brings us to Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, a place already heavy with history, blood, and struggle. But in 1896, its story bent towards something else entirely. Something smaller than war, but in many ways darker. A house, two sisters, a parlor that promised warmth, and a supper table where kindness was a mask. What drove them? Was it hunger, madness, desperation born of poverty in a town already scarred by the past? Or was it something more deliberate? Something cold, calculated, and terrifying in its precision? These are not simple questions, and the answers may be even harder to stomach. But before we descend deeper, I want you to ask yourself something. Picture it. You are a traveler in 1896. The night is colder than you expected. The town is small, quiet, and every boarding house seems full. But you see one home. A lantern glowing in the window, the outline of a woman at the curtain, a soft voice calling you inside, the promise of a hot meal, a warm bed, a safe roof above your head. Would you step inside? Would you sit at that supper table? Or would you turn back into the dark, trusting only the road beneath your feet and the sound of your own heartbeat? Tell me, write it below, because this story is about choices, the sisters' choices, the town's choices, and in a way, our choices. The ones that ripple forward through time, echoing long after the people themselves are gone. When you leave your thoughts, you're not just commenting. You're joining a chain of voices stretching back more than a century, weighing the same impossible question. When does hospitality become a trap? And while you're here, if you want more of these buried histories, these silenced horrors, make sure you subscribe. This channel exists for one reason: to give voice to what others have tried to erase. Because erasure is its own kind of violence, and yet, even erased stories bleed through. You'll see that tonight, but I'll give you a warning. What lies ahead in this case is not easy listening. The accounts we've uncovered are fragmented. Some are from neighbors who spoke only in whispers. Others are from journals, police records, scraps of testimony that were quickly buried. And in those fragments, patterns begin to form. Patterns that suggest the sisters of Harpers Ferry did more than simply serve supper. What they did has no easy explanation. So, take a moment, breathe. Ask yourself, would you have stepped into that parlor? Would you have taken the plate they offered? Or would you have trusted your instincts? That itch at the back of your neck, the shadow that seemed just a little too still. Because once you stepped across that threshold in 1896, your choice might have been the last one you ever made, and that is where our story takes us next. To the parlor, to the supper table, and to the shadows that history itself tried to choke into silence. Stay with me. The night is only beginning. Harpers Ferry in the late 19th century was a town balanced between history and survival. By 1896, the memory of John Brown's raid was still whispered in schoolrooms, and the scars of the Civil War were etched into its very foundations. Crumbling stone walls bore bullet pockets. Abandoned armories sat as silent witnesses to the nation's bloodiest conflict. Travelers who stepped off the train often remarked that Harpers Ferry felt like a place half alive, half haunted. Ferry felt like a place half alive, half haunted. Yet life pressed forward. The railroads had turned the town into a crossroads of America. Iron tracks carried coal, timber, and soldiers during the war. By the 1890s, they carried drifters, salesmen, laborers, and fortune seekers. Each week, dozens of strangers flowed through the streets. For a town still rebuilding, those strangers were both a blessing and a threat. They brought money, but they also brought risk. Boarding houses thrived in this transient economy. A traveler needed food and rest, and respectable families could earn steady income by renting rooms or offering a hot supper. For some, it was a livelihood. For others, it was an opportunity. The sisters' house stood just a few streets away from the train station. From the outside, it was ordinary, even inviting. Whitewashed walls, lace curtains hanging neatly, always freshly pressed. In the warmer months, geraniums bloomed on the windowsill, their red petals vivid against the pale wood. Smoke curled gently from the chimney most evenings, carrying with it the smell of broth, bread, or spiced stews. To the casual passerby, the home was a picture of modest respectability. Neighbors recalled that the two women kept mostly to themselves. They were polite when addressed, but never chatty, always together, always watching. The younger of the two seemed to smile more easily, but her laughter rarely reached her eyes. The elder carried herself with a certain severity, her back straight, her gaze sharp enough to quiet a child mid-tantrum. They attended church irregularly, and when they did, they sat in the far corner pew. They never lingered afterward for fellowship, never stayed for tea. They walked home quickly, skirts rustling, boots clicking against the cobblestones. Some townsfolk admired their privacy. Others found it unsettling. In a place like Harpers Ferry, people noticed details. They noticed how often the sisters' curtains twitched at night, as though someone inside watched the street after midnight. They noticed the cellar door, always locked, even in the hottest days of summer when most households aired out their basements. They noticed that the sisters welcomed strangers readily, yet rarely spoke of them after they had gone. At first, it was nothing more than gossip. Every town breeds it. A missing salesman here, a farmhand who never collected his wages there. Some shrugged it off. In a town built on constant movement, disappearances were hardly shocking. Men came and went without explanation all the time, but whispers began to take shape. A merchant's assistant swore he had heard strange sounds one night while passing their lane, a muffled cry, quickly silenced. A local boy claimed that when he tossed a stone over their fence, something growled from the shadows, though no dog was ever seen on the property. And one neighbor, returning late from the station, swore she saw lantern light in the cellar through a crack in the boards, though the sisters always denied ever going down there after dark. The house began to draw an invisible line across town. Some families accepted the sisters at face value, glad that someone offered a roof to strangers passing through. Others grew wary, warning their children not to linger near the gate, not to take sweets if offered. And as the months passed, an unease spread, not loud, not open, but quiet, insistent, like a draft beneath a door. That unease grew sharper when people began to tally the disappearances, the drifter who had promised to send for his trunk but never returned. The peddler whose last known meal was at the sisters' table. The railway laborer is seen entering their parlor one stormy night, never to be seen again. Each case could be explained. Each could be dismissed. But together they began to form a shadow. Still, the sheriff wrote nothing. The town paper mentioned nothing. In a community struggling to rebuild its reputation after war, scandal was a luxury no one could afford. And so the silence thickened, but silence cannot erase unease. And in Harpers Ferry, 1896, that unease turned slowly into dread. Because behind those whitewashed walls, behind the lace curtains and the smell of stew, something was festering. And soon, it would no longer remain hidden. The first clue did not arrive in a shout, but in a whisper. It was not an official report, not a headline printed in ink, but a rumor that crawled from lip to lip in Harpers Ferry. A traveling salesman, a man known for his punctuality, never arrived at his next stop. He had passed through the town only days before, carrying his samples in a heavy trunk. That trunk was his livelihood, his proof of trade, his only means of persuading strangers to open their doors. But when he failed to appear in Winchester, his family sent letters, then telegrams. Then finally a man was dispatched to search. The search turned up nothing, at least nothing living. Weeks later, the trunk was found. It had been dragged half off the lane, wedged into the mud near a hedgerow not far from the sisters' property. Its lock was broken. Its contents spilled out, damp and ruined. Pieces of fabric samples clung to the muck. Pages of an order book were soaked through. The sisters said nothing about it. The sheriff dismissed it as an accident, claiming the salesman likely abandoned the trunk and moved on. But the family, grieving and desperate, knew otherwise. He had not abandoned it. He had not abandoned them. Something had happened on that road, and the trunk was the only witness. Still, no arrests were made. No further questions were asked. The sheriff's silence was louder than any denial, and then came the lodger. It was a stormy night, late summer, when a man stumbled into the sheriff's office. His clothes were wet, his face pale, his hands shaking so badly he could barely light the lantern on the desk. He refused to sit, refused even to speak clearly, but in fragmented words and broken phrases he said he had seen something upstairs in the sisters' boarding house. The sheriff pressed him for details. Was it a crime? A theft? A fight? The man only shook his head. Not theft, not fight. Something wrong. He would not elaborate, would not even drink the whiskey pressed into his hand. And before dawn, he was gone. He left Harpers Ferry without a trace, abandoning his belongings, leaving behind only the tremor in his voice that night. No one knew what he saw. No one ever would. But after that night, the sisters' house no longer seemed ordinary. Neighbors said the lantern in the upstairs window burned later than usual, flickering against the curtains until well past midnight. The smell of stew and bread grew rarer, replaced with the acrid scent of smoke and something sharp, metallic, that carried strangely on the wind. Their windows, once open to catch the summer air, now stayed shut. Darker, heavier, and fewer men knocked at their door. But not all. Some were hungry, too tired from the rails to question the rumors. Others were reckless, scoffing at gossip and shadows. They paid their coin, stepped across the threshold, and disappeared into the warmth of that house. They were never seen again. The whispers grew bolder. Children dared each other to walk past the gate after sundown. They claimed they heard voices, low, indistinct, but not the sisters. Sometimes two, sometimes three, sometimes more. A drunk leaving the tavern swore he saw someone pulling a body-shaped bundle toward the cellar. He laughed it off the next morning, blaming the whiskey. But the story lingered. And then, as if to mock the silence of the law, another clue surfaced. A railway porter, tasked with moving luggage at the station, claimed he recognized a coat, a fine wool jacket that had belonged to the missing salesman. But it wasn't the salesman wearing it. It was the elder sister, walking briskly through the street one gray morning, the collar turned high against the wind. When he told others, they scoffed. Perhaps he was mistaken. Perhaps it only resembled the salesman's coat. But the porter swore on his wages. He had carried that coat himself, months before, when the salesman first stepped off the train. He remembered the weight, the color, the frayed edge on the cuff. He knew what he had seen. Still, the sheriff made no inquiries. No report was filed, and so the town sank deeper into a silence that was not ignorance, but fear. The clues were fragments, a trunk in the mud, a lodger's broken words, a coat worn by the wrong shoulders. Not enough for action, each enough to stir dread, and dread is a seed. It grows in the gaps left by truth. By autumn, few dared to approach the sisters' parlor. The meals once praised for their warmth now carried rumors of strange aftertastes. Guests whispered of bitterness in the broth, of meat that was too soft, too gray. Some said it was simply poor cooking, others were not so sure. It was around this time that one man, name lost to history, was said to have fled the house in terror. Accounts differ. Some claimed he ran barefoot into the street screaming that the dead walk upstairs. Others swore he muttered only one word over and over, cellar. Whatever the truth, he vanished by the next morning. No one knew whether he boarded a train or was silenced before he could tell his story. But one fact remained. After that night, the sisters' boarding house was no longer spoken of with neutrality. It was spoken of with fear. The sisters themselves seemed unaffected. They continued their routines. The younger still offered polite nods to neighbors. The elder still kept her back straight, her eyes sharp. If whispers reached them, they gave no sign. If they noticed the dwindling visitors, they did not show concern, but those who watched closely swore the sisters had changed. Their trips to the market grew rarer. When they did appear, they bought in odd quantities: sacks of salt, jars of lye, bundles of cloth. Items less for nourishment than for preservation, for concealment. Their hands, once neatly gloved, now bore stains, dark beneath the nails, resistant to scrubbing, and sometimes, at dawn, when the mist clung low over the river, neighbors swore they saw them returning from the woods, dragging something heavy beneath a tarp. No one asked questions. No one dared. The clues were there. Visible, tangible. A trunk, a coat, a runaway lodger's fear. But Harpers Ferry, weary from war and haunted by its own past, did not want another scandal. Did not want another story to stain its streets. So the clues were left to rot, like the samples in the salesman's trunk, damp and ruined. And while the silence thickened, the sisters continued. For those who did knock at their door, whether from hunger, fatigue, or reckless disbelief, supper was always waiting, and supper was always the last meal they would ever eat. At last, the whispers reached a breaking point. For months, Harpers Ferry had lived with unease: the missing salesman, the abandoned trunk, the lodger who fled into the storm. At first, these were only fragments, pieces of gossip spoken in hushed tones. But by autumn, the fragments formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Families of the missing men pressed the sheriff harder. They demanded records, names, receipts of train arrivals and departures. Too many of them could trace their loved one's last known step to the same threshold, the sisters' house. Ministers thundered from their pulpits. They spoke of sin lurking even in respectable houses, of Judas's kiss, of wolves in sheep's clothing. Congregations murmured uneasily, their eyes flicking toward the street where the sisters lived. And though he resisted, though he told himself it was nothing more than grief twisting into suspicion, the sheriff finally relented. Deputies were sent to the sisters' home. The knock at the door came on a cold morning. The sisters answered together. Their appearance was neat, their faces composed. The elder met the deputy's gaze with a steady calm. The younger offered a faint smile, as though greeting old friends. They asked what business had brought the law to their door. The deputies entered. What they found first was only suspicion. In the cellar, the light of their lanterns fell upon scraps of torn clothing. A boot without its pair, a strip of fabric, stained and stiff, half buried beneath sawdust. At first glance, it might have been nothing, a forgotten rag, a misplaced garment, but there were too many scraps, tucked into corners pressed against damp walls, too many to dismiss. On the floor they noticed stains, dark patches uneven in shape sunk deep into the wood. The sisters claimed it was spilled stew, spilled wine, the mess of years in a damp cellar. But the deputies shifted uneasily. The stains did not spread like food or drink. They clung, sharp-edged, as though something heavier than broth had seeped into the grain. In the kitchen, the iron pot still sat on the stove. Its contents were warm, simmering slowly, the steam curling into the air. One deputy lifted the lid. Inside was meat, thick, stringy, pale in a way that was difficult to name. The sisters smiled calmly. They explained it was mutton, bought cheaply from the butcher. But when asked to produce a receipt, they shrugged. Why would one keep paper for a simple stew? The deputies did not answer. They only noted the smell. It was not rancid, but it was not mutton. The questions turned sharper. Where were the men who lodged here? Where were the salesman's belongings? Why did the lantern burn so late at night? The sisters' answers were soft, but they did not bend. Drifters often left items behind, they said. A jacket, a trunk, a book. Who could account for the habits of men who moved from town to town without roots? As for the missing, they offered silence. They folded their hands. They exchanged a glance, and they said nothing more. The silence unsettled the deputies more than any denial could have. The sheriff was informed. His patience, already thin from pressure, snapped. He ordered the house watch. Night after night, deputies took turns across the street, hidden in the shadows. They saw the elder sister move about the parlor, carrying lanterns from room to room. They saw the younger tend to the stove, even at hours when no meal should have been cooking. And always they saw the cellar door closed, locked, guarded. Neighbors began to report new details. They swore they heard dragging sounds at odd hours. The scrape of something heavy pulled across the floor. Dogs tied to porches howled when the sisters walked past, and once, just once, a deputy claimed he heard a sound from the cellar itself. Not a thud, not the shifting of wood or tools. A groan, low, humans. He did not repeat it aloud, but he wrote it in his report. Suspicion was no longer enough. The sheriff knew he needed proof. One evening, deputies returned with a warrant. The sisters did not resist. They stepped aside, offering their home as though they had nothing to hide. The search began. The parlor was tidy. Lace curtains hung unwrinkled. The Bible sat on the mantel, its pages clean. Nothing there spoke of sin. The kitchen, too, was neat. Dishes stacked. The pot cleaned, its surface scrubbed until it gleamed. But the cellar, the deputies descended slowly, lanterns in hand. The air grew colder. The smell is sharper. What had seemed like spilled stew on their first visit now appeared more deliberate. Patches in the floor where the wood had been scrubbed raw. Marks along the beams, faint but unmistakable, as though ropes had once been tied there. And in one corner, half hidden beneath a pile of burlap sacks, they found a trunk. It was not the salesman's. This one was smaller, older. Its lock rusted, its surface scarred. When they forced it open, they expected papers, clothes, anything ordinary, but inside were bones, small bones. Not complete, not whole. A rib, a finger, a piece of jaw, each wrapped in cloth as if kept, not discarded. When the deputies carried the trunk upstairs, the sisters did not flinch. The elder said only, "Those are relics from our family, buried and unearthed by accident. They mean nothing." The younger one said nothing at all. The sheriff's hands trembled as he wrote his next orders. The sisters were not arrested, not yet. He knew the town, knew the law. Proof had to be undeniable, but he set the watch closer, tighter. Every night, men were stationed at the corners of the lane, their eyes fixed on the house. And it wasn't long before those shadows revealed what truly took place behind the curtains, because the sisters had grown careless. One night, well past midnight, deputies saw them carry something heavy from the cellar. It was wrapped in cloth, bound with rope. They dragged it into the yard, where a hole had been dug in the earth. The deputies crept closer, breath tight in their throats. The sisters lowered the bundle into the hole. Dirt followed, shovelful by shovelful, until the shape was covered, but not before one corner of the cloth slipped, revealing what lay beneath. An arm, pale, motionless. The deputies pulled back, hearts pounding. They had seen enough. By dawn, the sheriff had summoned more men. The grave was opened, and the truth that emerged from that soil was not stew, not mutton, not relics. It was human, and it was only the beginning. The sisters' house no longer looked like a home. To passers-by, the lace curtains and tidy porch still remained, but no one in Harpers Ferry was fooled. Deputies stood watch at the corners of the lane, their lanterns casting long, uneasy shadows across the sisters' gate. Children were forbidden to walk past it. Dogs pulled their owners in the opposite direction. The air around the place seemed heavier, as though the house itself exhaled secrets. And then came the farmer. He was a quiet man, not prone to talk, but on a frost-streaked morning he approached the sheriff with a story. A week earlier, he had been tending his cows near the tree line when he saw lantern light moving among the woods. Two figures, women. They struggled with something long and heavy wrapped in canvas. He had thought it was firewood, though strange that firewood would need to be dragged rather than carried. But now, with rumors sharpening into accusations, he could not ignore what he had seen. The sheriff listened, jaw tight, eyes narrowing. If the sisters had indeed carried something into the woods, it might still be there. Deputies were sent with shovels. They returned with nothing but churned earth and signs of disturbed leaves. Whatever had been buried or hidden was gone, but the testimony lingered like smoke. Days later, a man arrived from across the county. He introduced himself as a former boarder, a salesman who had stayed in the sisters' house only once. At first he was reluctant, shifting in his chair as if unsure whether to speak. But at last, the words poured out. He remembered the meal. Stew, he said, thick and fragrant, ladled into his bowl with the elder sister's steady hand. He remembered the taste, oddly metallic, though he told himself it was the flavor of old iron from the pot. But what lodged in his mind, what kept him from sleep for months afterward, were the bones. Small, pale, brittle, too fine for mutton, Too fragile for beef, he had pushed his spoon aside. He had not finished the meal, and by dawn he left the house, never to return. The sheriff recorded every word. When asked why he had not spoken sooner, the man only shook his head. "Who would believe me?" he whispered. His head. "Who would believe me?" he whispered. The town did not need convincing anymore. Whispers had curdled into certainty. Parishioners refused to sit beside the sisters in church. Merchants would not sell to them. The very air of Harpers Ferry seemed to turn against the women. Still, the sheriff knew suspicion was not enough. He needed proof that would silence even the most cautious doubters. Proof that would stand before a judge. So he ordered another search. The deputies returned to the house, lanterns in hand, boots heavy on the wooden floor. The sisters watched from the parlor, faces unreadable as boards were pried loose. Dust filled the air, thick and choking, and beneath the floorboards they found it. A trunk, smaller than the last, hidden deep, wedged between beams. Its iron latch resisted, but the deputies forced it open. Inside lay not clothing, not papers, but hair. Locks of it, tied neatly with ribbon, each bundle distinct. Brown-black fair, some long, some cropped. Dozens of them, each preserved as though meant for a collection. One deputy recoiled. Another crossed himself. When the trunk was lifted from the ground and placed before the sisters, the elder raised her chin. "Relics," she said again. "Keepsakes from kin. Nothing more." But her words rang hollow in the stale air. The discovery lit a fire under the town. People crowded outside the sheriff's office, demanding to know how long the law would wait before acting. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers cursed the slowness of justice. The sister's name, once uttered politely in shops and gatherings, became a hiss, a curse, and still, the most damning revelation had yet to come. It began with a shallow grave. Deputies, following the farmer's tale of disturbed earth, widened their search around the sister's property. They walked the fence line, they combed the woods, and one night, guided by the sweep of lantern light, a deputy's boot struck something hard beneath the soil. The digging began. The earth gave way easily, as though it had been turned not long before. Within minutes, the shape emerged. A body, wrapped clumsily in cloth, shallowly buried, the dirt settling too close to the surface. When the cloth was pulled back, the face of a traveler appeared, recognizable to those who had seen him in town weeks earlier. His flesh bore marks no animal could have made. Cuts, deliberate, sharp, running in jagged lines. The deputies fell silent. The wood seemed to hold its breath. By dawn, the grave had been exhumed fully and the body carried into town. The sheriff stood over it, jaw set like stone. He did not need the coroner to tell him what it meant. The case was no longer rumored. It was proof. Word spread like wildfire. The boarding house was no longer a place of suspicion, but a house of death. Strangers came from miles away to stand at the edge of the property, pointing, whispering, crossing themselves. Mothers kept their children indoors after sunset. Men who once sought a hot meal and a soft bed now gave the road a wide berth. The sisters still inside did not wail or beg. They moved calmly through their rooms as though nothing around them had changed. When deputies entered to watch them, they offered tea. When neighbors hurled curses from the street, they drew the curtains. But their composure did nothing to soften the evidence that piled higher each day. At last, the sheriff had no choice. On a gray morning, with the town gathered in a tense silence, deputies approached the boarding house with shackles. The sisters stood in their parlor, hands folded, eyes fixed on the men who had come to take them. The elder spoke first. "You bring shame to this house," she said quietly, as though the deputies were the guilty ones. The younger one smiled faintly, almost sweetly. "But you will see," she whispered. "You will see. They did not fight. They did not scream. They allowed the iron to close around their wrists." And as they were led through the crowd, the people of Harpers Ferry leaned in to stare, some in fury, some in fear, all with the same question burning in their minds. How many? The truth had bled into daylight, but daylight did not bring comfort. If anything, it cast the horror in sharper relief. The farmer's testimony, the boarder's memory of strange bones in stew, the hidden trunk with locks of hair, the shallow grave with its mutilated victim, together, they painted a picture too grim for denial. The sisters' house was sealed, boards nailed across the door, deputies posted at the gate. But even with the women shackled in the sheriff's jail, the unease did not fade. For if this was what had been found in a matter of weeks, what might lie still buried? What other graves, what other trunks, what other secrets slept beneath the soil of Harpers Ferry, waiting for the spade to uncover them? The investigation was not over. It had only begun. And as the sisters sat in their cells, their lips closed tight as the grave, the town wondered whether the true number of the missing would ever be known. The arrest should have ended it. In a town still haunted by the echoes of war, in a place where order was prized above all else, the sight of two women shackled and led through the streets should have drawn a final line beneath the story. The law had acted. The danger was contained. The people of Harpers Ferry should have been able to breathe again. But they did not, because the arrest was not the end. It was only the beginning of something darker, something the town could not control, no matter how many locks clanged shut or how many watchmen stood guard at the jailhouse door. The trial was scheduled for spring. By then the ground had thawed, the rivers ran high, and the eyes of the state had turned toward Harpers Ferry. Trains pulled into the station carrying not only passengers, but curiosity seekers, reporters, and men who claimed to be investigators from as far away as Richmond and Baltimore. The courthouse itself became a fortress. Deputies lined the doors. Curious onlookers filled the benches, some clutching rosaries, others clutching notebooks. The air inside was heavy, carrying the musk of too many bodies crammed into too small a space, and at the center of it all, calm, still, unblinking, sat the sisters. They did not look like killers. That was the phrase that passed from lip to lip in the courtroom, whispered by women who had once bought flour beside them, muttered by men who had once tipped their hats when passing them in the lane. The elder sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes forward, face unreadable. The younger sat just behind, her posture softer, almost gentle, her mouth curled in the faintest suggestion of a smile. If they were nervous, they hid it well. If they were guilty, they wore it like a second skin. The prosecution opened with the shallow grave. The coroner spoke of cuts deliberate and deep. He spoke of ligature marks at the wrists and bruises at the throat. He spoke in the careful, clinical tone of a man who had seen many bodies, but his words left the courtroom shivering. Next came the farmer. His testimony about lanterns in the woods was delivered with a trembling voice, yet every detail felt carved into stone. The dragging, the weight, the disturbed earth. The jury leaned in, their eyes fixed on him. Then came the salesman, the boarder who had left the house at dawn. His words about pale bones in stew sent a gasp through the gallery. Someone muttered a prayer. A woman fainted. The judge rapped his gavel for order, but the unease did not subside. And finally, the deputies. They spoke of the trunk beneath the floorboards, of the ribbons, the locks of hair, the neatness of the collection. Each description added another nail to the sisters' coffin in the public mind. And yet, it was not the witnesses who chilled the courtroom most. It was the sisters themselves. When the elder was asked directly, "Why did men vanish in your home?" she did not hesitate. She did not fumble for an excuse. She looked directly at the prosecutor, her eyes dark and steady, and replied, "Some suppers are not meant to be remembered." The words fell into the air like a blade. The room erupted, shouts, gasps, cries for order. The gavel thundered against the bench, but the elder only lowered her gaze once more, serene as a nun in prayer. And beside her, the younger sister smiled. Newspapers scrambled to cover the trial, but the story refused to stay within ink and print. Some editors claimed the details were too grotesque for public consumption. They refused to run the words cannibalism, even when shouted openly in court. Others bowed to pressure from civic leaders who feared the tale would stain Harpers Ferry forever, marking it as a place of horror. Headlines appeared, then disappeared. Articles were printed, then retracted. By the end of the week, entire editions were pulled from circulation, but suppression only stoked curiosity. What could be so vile that newspapers would not dare print it? Rumors spread faster than print ever could. Men carried the story in saloons. Women whispered it in sewing circles. Children repeated it at school, their versions twisted into nightmares. The sisters were no longer merely women on trial. They were becoming something else. Each retelling stripped away another layer of humanity. Some called them witches, born of the mountains, feeding on flesh in rituals older than the town itself. Others called them specters, hollowed out by hunger, cursed to walk in skirts and smiles while hungering for what no table should hold. Still others said they were simply women driven mad by grief, taking their vengeance on every man who dared cross their threshold. But whatever the explanation, one thing became certain. The sisters of Harpers Ferry were no longer seen as flesh and blood. Of Harpers Ferry were no longer seen as flesh and blood. They had become legends while still alive. The defense tried. They claimed the grave was the work of vagrants, that the trunk of hair was nothing more than sentimental keepsakes from relatives, that the stew was mutton, nothing more. They reminded the jury that no one had ever seen the sisters commit the crimes. That suspicion, no matter how heavy, was not the same as proof. But their voices were drowned in the tide of testimony, in the whispers that rolled like thunder through the crowd, in the gaze of the sisters themselves, serene, unshaken, as though already beyond reach of earthly law. The twist came when former residents of the town, men and women who had left years before, returned to testify. They spoke of nights long ago, when screams drifted faintly through the sisters' windows. They spoke of relatives who vanished on journeys that had led them through Harpers Ferry. One woman recalled being served stew at the boarding house as a child, and though she could not prove its contents, the memory of its coppery taste lingered with her even now. Each testimony added a layer to the legend. Each word, whether fact or memory or fear, made the sisters into something larger, something untouchable. By the end of the trial, the air in Harpers Ferry was suffocating with dread. People swore they could smell stew on the wind when they passed the courthouse. Children whispered that the sisters' eyes glowed red in the dark. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of unchecked sin, about women who tempted men not with beauty, but with death. The sisters themselves gave little away. The elder remained cold and quiet. The younger sometimes smiled faintly, even humming softly when the courtroom grew too loud, and the more human they appeared, the less human the town believed them to be. When the verdict was delayed, rumors deepened. Some said jurors had been bribed. Others said the sisters had cursed the men deciding their fate. A deputy swore he saw the elder sister's lips moving silently, as though in prayer or incantation, as the jury filed out. By then, truth and superstition had become inseparable. The line between evidence and legend blurred, and no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The arrest had not ended it. The trial had not ended. If anything, both had only given the sisters new life, turning them into shadows that reached far beyond Harpers Ferry, beyond 1896, beyond the walls of the courtroom itself. They were no longer merely two women accused of murder. They were hungry given shape. They were whispers turned flesh, and no verdict could silence that. The sisters' house did not survive long after the trial. At first it was boarded up, its windows nailed shut, its doors chained by order of the sheriff. For months, it stood like a wound in the center of Harpers Ferry, a reminder of something no sermon could cleanse, no prayer could bury. Neighbors avoided it. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Even dogs, some said, refused to approach the gate, but silence is not the same as peace, because the house was not forgotten. It lingered, it brooded, and in time, it began to grow in power, not as a building of wood and brick, but as a symbol. When the sheriff finally ordered it torn down, the demolition crew worked in silence. They refused to swing hammers at night. They claimed the walls groaned when struck, as if the house itself resented its own destruction. One worker swore he heard humming from inside the cellar, though no one had been down there in months. Another quit after prying up a floorboard and finding stains that had never faded. By the time the last beam fell, men spat on the ground and walked away without looking back. The lot was left empty, the earth scarred, the foundation rotting beneath weeds and wildflowers. But the story did not vanish. If anything, it grew. Families of the missing carried their grief in silence. Most refused to speak of it. Some even moved away as though distance could shield them from memory. The men who had vanished were rarely spoken of in public anymore. Their names, once prayed aloud in church, were reduced to whispers in kitchens, muttering regrets behind closed doors. For many, the shame was too much. To admit a loved one had died, there was to admit they had sat at the sisters' table, that they had eaten their final meal beneath those lace curtains. Better, some thought, to bury the memory than to let it follow them like a shadow. And so silence spread. Ministers, however, did not remain quiet. From the pulpit, the story of the sisters became a cautionary tale. Sin, they thundered, could hide in any home, even those that seemed tidy and God-fearing. Hospitality could become a mask for evil, and hunger, whether of the body, the soul, or something darker, could turn even women into monsters. But the sermons never named the sisters directly. They were not remembered as people anymore, only as symbols. Their names dissolved into metaphor, their deeds into allegory. That erasure was not accidental, because the authorities too wanted the story gone. Court transcripts were filed away, many redacted, whole pages vanishing into lost archives. Newspapers pulled their editions from circulation, their coverage stripped down to vague allusions of unspeakable crimes. In one record, the sisters were referred to only as the accused. In another, a margin note in the clerk's hand read simply, "Better forgotten." To this day, no complete account of the trial survives. What we have are fragments, scattered testimony, rumor recorded as fact, fact recorded as rumor. What remains is less a case file and more a ghost itself, lingering in the gaps of history. But Harpers Ferry remembered. Children dared each other to walk past the empty lot at night. Some swore they saw a figure standing there holding a lantern that burned without flame. Others claimed to hear humming, soft, steady, low, as though two voices blended together beneath the earth. On windy nights, mothers would tell their children not to stray too close, for fear the sisters might reach from the soil and pull them down to supper. Even as the town modernized, even as railroads and factories replaced old scars, the empty lot remained a place of avoidance, a scar no one touched. It is said that when new homes were proposed for the site, builders refused the contracts. Not a single man wanted to raise his roof where the sisters once stood. And so for decades the ground lay barren. Historians, looking back, point to this case as one of the earliest banned crime stories in American history. At the time, crime reporting was often sensational. Papers thrived on scandal, printing lurid details of murders, robberies, and scandals with little hesitation. But the sisters' case was different. Authorities feared it was too destabilizing. To publish it openly was to admit that ordinary women in a respectable town could lure men to their deaths, feed them tainted meals, bury them in shallow graves. To acknowledge cannibalism, hinted or confirmed, was to admit a darkness too grotesque for civilized society. And so they buried it, not in coffins but in silence. Yet fragments survived. A diary entry from a juror describing the sisters' unnatural calm. A clipping from a Baltimore paper, later censored, describing the stew served with too much iron. A sermon's notes, preserved in a minister's Bible, urging his flock to beware of tables set by the ungodly. Piece by piece, the story reassembled itself, not whole, but broken, jagged like shards of glass. And perhaps that is why it still unsettles us. Because we can never know the full truth. Only whispers, only shadows, only echoes. Even now, the tale of the sisters resurfaces whenever scandals erupt around those entrusted with care, hospitality, or trust. When a boarding school scandal breaks, the sisters' names resurface in footnotes. When hospitals are caught mistreating patients, their legend is whispered in criminology classrooms. When funeral home directors are exposed for grotesque betrayals, researchers trace the lineage back, connecting threads to 1896, to Harpers Ferry, to the sisters who served more than supper. Their names may be gone, but their shadow remains. In recent years, ghost tours of Harpers Ferry have begun to include their story once more. Guides pause at the site of the old lot, telling tourists of the women who welcomed travelers with stew and of the men who never left. Some describe feeling watched. Others claim their recordings capture faint humming in the background. Locals roll their eyes, but still, no one builds there. The ground is still bare. The silence is still heavy. the shadow is still long. Because no matter how many sermons thunder, no matter how many court records vanish, no matter how many years pass, some truths refuse to stay buried. The sisters may be forgotten by name, but the hunger they represented, hunger disguised as kindness, hunger masked by hospitality, hunger that devoured trust itself, remains alive in the telling. And that is why their story matters still. Not just as a crime, not just as a rumor, but as a shadow that reminds us. The darkest evils are not always in battlefields or wilderness. Sometimes they are in kitchens, in parlors, in supper bowls passed with steady hands and quiet smiles. The sisters are gone, their house is gone, but the fear they left behind is still here, waiting, eating. Evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it smiles from across a supper table. Sometimes it pours your drink, folds your napkin, and asks if you'd like more. That is the lesson of the Harpers Ferry sisters. We like to imagine that evil is loud, easy to spot, men with knives in the street, thieves in alleys, soldiers with muskets on battlefields. But what unsettles us most about this story is how quiet it is. The sisters did not storm houses. They did not stalk roads with pistols. They waited. They opened their door. They set a table, and they smiled. Men walked in by choice. They sat at that table by choice. They lifted spoons and tasted broth by choice. And that is what makes the story so unbearable. Not just what the sisters did, but what they revealed. That trust is fragile. That hospitality, that most sacred of social bonds, can be weaponized. That sometimes the most dangerous battlefield is not outside, but inside, lit by a lantern, where supper simmers and laughter flows. The house is gone now. The foundations are long buried. The earth seeded over with weeds. But memory is not so easily erased. Walk through Harpers Ferry and you will hear it if you listen, the faint notes of an old warning, like the toll of a bell across water. Locals may not speak their names, but they will warn their children. Be careful whose table you sit at. Because history is not made only of wars and treaties. It is also made of suppers. And some suppers leave stains no water can wash away. Ask yourself, why do we tell this story still? It is not only a crime. Crimes, after all, are endless. Names of murderers are written in police ledgers by the thousands. But this story, clings to us like smoke, because it unsettles the very thing we want to believe about ourselves. That home is safe, that a meal is a blessing, that those who serve us, house us, host us are trustworthy. The sisters remind us that none of those things are guaranteed, and that is why, even censored, even redacted, even buried in lost court files, their story refuses to die. Think for a moment about the families of the missing. They were not just robbed of their sons, husbands, fathers. They were robbed of certainty. How many nights did they sit at their own tables, staring at empty chairs, wondering what final meal had been served, wondering whether their loved one's last sip of stew carried comfort or poison? That is the cruelty beneath the cruelty, not just death, but the shattering of trust. Because once trust is gone, nothing feels safe. And what of the town? The ministers thundered. The newspapers were censored. The law scrambled to cover what could not be explained. But could anyone in Harpers Ferry ever again accept a stranger's invitation to supper without thinking of that cellar, that iron pot, that humming from beneath the floor? The sisters left more than bodies. They left suspicion. They left in silence. They left the kind of unease that seeps into generations. Perhaps that is why the lot where their house stood has never truly been reclaimed. Grass grows there, yes. Weeds bloom and wither. But no walls rise, no roof shelter. The ground seems to resist rebuilding, as though it remembers, as though it warns. Every town has its ghost stories. But this one is not just about ghosts. It is about appetite. It is about the moment trust becomes a weapon, and that is harder to banish than any spirit. Now step back from Harpers Ferry, step forward into the present. Ask yourself, how many times has this happened again? How many other stories, quieter still, have been buried, redacted, forgotten? Not always with iron pots and cellars, but in hospitals where patients trusted nurses, in schools where children trusted teachers, in churches where congregations trusted pastors. Hospitality, care, protection, all masks, all aprons, all tables where evil sometimes sits, waiting with a smile. The sisters were not unique. They were simply early. That is the horror of it. The thought that this story is not singular but archetypal. That their supper table is not just theirs, but a shadow cast across centuries. Because every time trust is betrayed, Every time care becomes cruelty, every time hospitality becomes a trap, the sisters' story stirs. Their shadow lengthens, their warning grows louder, and the humming beneath the earth becomes harder to ignore. You may think you would never fall for it. You would never knock on their door. You would never sit at their table. You would never take that spoon. But remember, those who did believe the same. They were men hardened by travel, scarred by war, accustomed to danger, and still the promise of warmth, a meal, a smile drew them in. That is how trust works. It disarms. It softens. It makes you vulnerable before you even realize it. And that is why betrayal at the supper table wounds deeper than bullets or knives, because it strikes at the very fabric of human connection. So what is the moral? Not to distrust every kindness, not to starve yourself for fear of poison. Life cannot be lived in suspicion alone. But the sisters' story teaches vigilance. It teaches that evil does not always announce itself with snarls and blood. Sometimes it whispers in hymns, sometimes it hums in kitchens, sometimes it ladles stew into your bowl with a steady hand. And if it happened once, in a quiet town already haunted by history, how many more times has it happened, unspoken, unrecorded? Tonight, as you sit down for supper, the food before you may be safe. The hands that serve it may be kind. But let the sisters remind you of fragility. Let them remind you that every act of trust is also a risk. Because the sisters did not just serve meals, they served a warning, and it lingers still. Evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it smiles from across a supper table. Sometimes it waits for you to take the first bite.